The Black Death did more than kill millions of people. It changed the price of human labor. Before the plague, many workers had little power to choose where they worked or what they were paid. After enormous numbers of people died, fields still needed planting, animals still needed tending, ships still needed loading, and buildings still needed repair. The work remained, but the workers did not. That imbalance forced rulers, landlords, and laborers into a struggle over wages, movement, and control. The result was not instant freedom. It was a new argument about what one person's time was worth. To understand that change, begin before the plague. Early 14th century Europe was not one uniform feudal system, but across many regions land, rent, customary obligations, and seasonal work tied households to local economies. Population pressure had reduced access to good land in some places, while the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already exposed how fragile food supplies could be. A poor harvest, a sick animal, or a landlord's demand could push a family toward hunger. Wage labor already existed, yet bargaining power was uneven, and many rural workers could not simply leave for a better offer. The pandemic emerged from a world that was already connected. Ancient DNA recovered from people buried near Lake Issyk-Kul in present-day Kyrgyzstan links a local outbreak in 1338 and 1339 to a strain of Yersinia pestis close to the ancestor of the Black Death lineage. The research supports an early 14th century source in Central Eurasia, although it does not turn every step of the journey west into a solved route. Trade, migration, and warfare connected inland markets with the Black Sea and Mediterranean. The same networks that moved cloth, grain, metal, and information could also move infected hosts and fleas. By 1347, reports of devastating disease appeared around Mediterranean ports, and over the following years, waves of plague struck Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia. Ships mattered, but they were only part of the system. Cargo moved through harbors into warehouses, carts, inns, markets, and homes. Rodents and their fleas could travel within those environments. Medieval observers could see that illness followed movement, but they could not see the bacterium or reconstruct the chain of transmission. A town might close a gate or reject a ship after danger was obvious, while infection had already crossed the boundary through another route. Plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The most common route to bubonic plague is the bite of an infected flea, often connected to infected rodents. The bacteria can multiply in a lymph node and produce the painful swellings called buboes. Plague can also enter the bloodstream, causing septicemic disease. If it reaches the lungs, pneumonic plague can spread through respiratory droplets during close contact. It is important not to collapse these forms into one cinematic image. Fleas were central to many infections, while direct person-to-person spread is associated with pneumonic plague and requires close exposure. For people in the 14th century, those distinctions were invisible. They saw fever, weakness, pain, swollen nodes, bleeding beneath the skin, and deaths that could follow with terrifying speed. Medical explanations drew on inherited theories of bodily balance, corrupted air, astrology, religious interpretation, and practical observation. Some communities isolated households or restricted movement. Others burned aromatic material, carried charms, prayed, fled, or searched for a human enemy to blame. The familiar beaked plague doctor costume belongs mainly to later outbreaks, not the first arrival of the Black Death. The fear was medieval. That famous mask was not yet its uniform. The number of dead cannot be counted with modern precision. Records are incomplete, regions were affected unevenly, and estimates depend on tax lists, burial evidence, manorial accounts, wills, and later reconstruction. Many historians place European losses somewhere around 1/3 to 1/2 of the population, with some communities suffering less and others far more. The essential fact is the scale. Millions of lives disappeared within a few years. Families lost children, parents, tenants, clergy, craftspeople, and neighbors. This was not a single dramatic week. Repeated waves continued, leaving communities to rebuild while fearing that the disease could return. Death on that scale removed both consumers and producers. Some fields were abandoned because there were not enough hands to cultivate them. Livestock could be neglected. Workshops lost masters and apprentices. Religious institutions lost clergy, while local governments lost officials who kept records and collected revenue. Yet demand for essential work did not vanish. Grain still had to be harvested, roofs still leaked, carts still broke, estates still needed servants. When two landlords competed for one surviving plowman, the balance changed. A worker who once accepted the local rate might demand more food, more cash, a shorter contract, or the freedom to take another offer. This is the mechanism behind the phrase labor shortage. It was not that every survivor suddenly became rich. It was that employers faced fewer available workers while many tasks remained urgent and seasonal. Missing the harvest could destroy an estate's income. That deadline gave some workers leverage. In England and elsewhere, surviving laborers could move between manors, negotiate payments in cash and food, or refuse terms that had once seemed unavoidable. The gains differed by occupation, gender, legal status, and region. Some people improved their position, others faced coercion, poverty, or laws designed to stop them from using their scarcity. England's government answered quickly. The Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351 tried to hold wages near pre-plague levels, compel able-bodied people to work, and restrict movement in search of better terms. The statute's own language reveals the conflict. It complained that workers, seeing the scarcity of servants and the needs of masters, refused service unless they received higher wages. That complaint is powerful evidence. The ruling response confirms that bargaining behavior had changed. The law was not written because labor markets stayed normal. It was written because employers and officials believed the old terms were slipping away. The law was more than an empty proclamation. Courts, local officials, and justices enforced labor rules in different ways, and historians still debate how effective that enforcement was across time and place. Workers could be fined for leaving contracts, employers could be accused of paying above legal rates, and mobility could be punished. But repeated legislation also shows how difficult the change was to contain. Governments had to keep returning to the issue because scarcity created incentives on both sides. A landlord might condemn high wages in public and quietly pay them when grain was ready to rot in the field. Wages themselves were not always simple coins handed over at the end of a day. Medieval compensation could include meals, grain, lodging, clothing, or longer-term service arrangements. New research using detailed English records shows that changes in labor relations cannot be measured by one national wage line. Some payments rose, some contracts shifted, and some benefits appeared in kind rather than cash. Inequality remained. Skilled workers could gain differently from unskilled workers. Young servants living in a household faced different choices from independent day laborers. The Black Death changed the negotiating field, but it did not give every survivor the same position on it. Women's opportunities show that unevenness clearly. The shortage of labor could open work and raise the value of some tasks performed by women, especially in service, agriculture, brewing, textiles, and urban trades. Yet legal ceilings, household structures, guild restrictions, and assumptions about women's work limited those gains. Evidence from English wages suggests that women did not simply receive the same post-plague advantage as men. A demographic shock can create opportunity without erasing institutions. The labor market became more flexible in some directions while preserving old inequalities in others. That tension is more accurate than a story in which the plague automatically liberated everyone. Land also changed value. When population fell, marginal fields could be abandoned, rents could come under pressure, and surviving families might inherit property from several dead relatives. In some regions, landlords shifted from directly managing labor-intensive estates toward leasing land. Pasture could replace some grain cultivation because animals required fewer workers. These changes were gradual and varied widely, but they mattered because labor scarcity interacted with land abundance. A household that could rent a better plot, leave an oppressive arrangement, or combine inherited holdings had options that earlier population pressure had restricted. The plague did not create land, but it changed the number of people competing for it. Cities changed too. Empty positions drew migrants from the countryside. Workshops needed apprentices, merchants needed porters, and households needed servants. Some newcomers found opportunity, others entered crowded neighborhoods still vulnerable to recurring disease. Municipal authorities regulated prices, wages, burial, sanitation, and movement with limited information. The result was not a clean transition from medieval to modern life. It was decades of adjustment in which older institutions tried to manage a new demographic reality. Trade recovered because people rebuilt the networks that had also carried danger. Connection remained economically necessary even after connection had helped spread catastrophe. The struggle over labor was only one consequence, and it must not hide the violence produced by fear. Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells and were attacked, expelled, or murdered in parts of Europe. Other outsiders and marginalized people also became targets. Scapegoating offered a simple human villain for a disaster whose biological cause was unknown. These persecutions did nothing to stop Yersinia pestis. They show how a society under extreme pressure can convert uncertainty into organized cruelty. Any account of improved bargaining for some survivors has to remain beside the fact that other survivors faced dispossession and death because their neighbors chose blame over evidence. Did the Black Death end feudalism? That claim is too simple. Europe contained many legal systems and labor arrangements, and major changes were already underway before 1347. In some places, landlords preserved control. In others, worker mobility, leasing, and wage bargaining expanded. Later revolts and political conflicts had causes beyond plague. What the pandemic did was accelerate pressure on systems that depended on abundant, controllable labor. It made contradictions visible. A hierarchy could declare that wages must remain fixed, but a harvest deadline could expose how much that hierarchy depended on the cooperation of people it treated as replaceable. That is the deeper reason the Black Death changed the price of labor. Disease removed people on a scale large enough to alter the relationship between work, land, and power. Survivors did not inherit one universal golden age. They inherited a contested economy, higher offers for some, coercive laws for others, new leases, abandoned fields, migration, inheritance, and repeated attempts by authorities to restore the old rules. The bacterium did not design those outcomes. Human institutions did. The plague created scarcity. Employers, workers, courts, and communities fought over what scarcity would mean. In that fight, ordinary labor became impossible for rulers to ignore.